series going on EGPS or grammar today, and a tricky one to start with. This is the subordinate clause. And I've got to be honest, when I trained to become a teacher and I read the phrase or read the title subordinate clause, I had absolutely no idea what it was. I had to reteach myself. So hopefully the fact that I've had to teach myself what it is again before becoming a year 6 teacher means I am uniquely placed to teach you, whether you're a parent or somebody who has to learn this. The great thing is we all actually use them all the time. So although they aren't easy to remember, we use them all the time in our writing. We use them all the time when we speak as well. But like lots of things in grammar, it's the fact that we can't remember what the term is. So when we get a question that says, highlight the subordinate clause in the sentence below, regardless of the fact that we use them all the time in our writing, it doesn't matter if you can't remember what a subordinate clause is. So I'm going to break down what the individual words mean. So hopefully we can get to grips with the questions a lot more quickly. The main thing to remember is they don't make sense on their own. So if you can just link that with the phrase subordinate clause, they don't make sense on their own, that will give you a clue as to how to identify one in a test paper or in your writing in general. So EGPS papers are all about decoding the terms. First things first, before we can talk about what is a subordinate clause, you need to know what a clause is, just a normal clause. And that is just a subject doing a verb. So I've put some examples here, which I'm going to use throughout the flip chart, throughout the little mini lesson, if you like. So Leela lit the firework is a clause because it makes sense on its own. You've got a subject, Leela, doing a verb. So lit the firework, and you've got the object at the end. You could also have it the other way around, but you've got the safe was searched by the masked man. So you've got a subject, still the masked man, even though it comes second in the sentence, and he's doing something, searching the safe. That's a clause because you can just say that on its own and it makes sense. So if we know what a clause is, a subject doing a verb, a character doing something essentially, subordinate means less important. So if you've got a less important clause, it requires something else to support it. It can also be called a dependent clause as well. It depends on something else being in the sentence, otherwise it wouldn't make sense. So it is still a clause. You still do have a subject doing a verb, but it depends on something else being in the sentence. Otherwise, you would just sound a bit odd when you said it. For example, a subordinate clause could be, although it was raining. If you just say that bit to somebody, if you just say, although it was raining, you're going to seem a bit odd. And you can kind of identify when it is a subordinate clause, because if you just said that part of it, you'd sound a bit strange. So if you just went up to somebody and said, although it was raining, they'd be expecting something else. They'd be actually expecting a main clause from you. So there is the identifier that you've just said or you've just written a subordinate clause. Doesn't make sense on its own. Another example is, whilst he still had time. So you're still talking about a person still having time, but just saying whilst he still had time wouldn't make sense on its own. And that's a major clue that is a subordinate clause or a dependent clause. It depends on more information to make sense. So let's combine the two things. So I gave you main clauses at the beginning. I then gave you examples of short subordinate clauses, and you should see what I mean when we add a subordinate clause to a main clause. Bear with me with all the terminology. So have a look on the screen here. Although it was raining, that's our subordinate clause. Leela lit the firework. So now it makes sense because we've got the subordinate clause adding extra detail, although it was raining, and the main clause, Leela lit the firework. So although it was raining, Leela lit the firework. Leela lit the firework would make sense on its own. And therefore, if I can find one of my pages, that is a main clause there. And then this bit, sub in blue, subordinate. You couldn't just say, although it was raining, wouldn't make sense on its own. Here's the other subordinate clause, whilst he still had time. Doesn't make sense on its own. But the safe was searched by the masked man would. Put them together. Whilst he still had time, the safe was searched by the masked man. So this is still a main clause. They are both clauses. But this one is subordinate because you'd sound odd if you just said that bit, and the end bit is the main clause. So they need to work together. Okay, here are some SATs questions. This is from the 2022 paper, I think. It says label each of the clauses in the sentence below as either a main clause with an M or subordinate with an S. So we use that easy test first. Here's the first one. After they've been for a swim. Could you go up to somebody and just say, after they've been for a swim? They wouldn't really know what you're going on about, so that's a subordinate clause. It doesn't make sense on its own. They would be expecting more information in the form of a main clause for the sentence to make sense. Next bit, the boys had a drink. That would make sense on its own. I know you might not have context for the other person, but the boys had a drink would just make sense on its own. You're not waiting for more information for that. It does stand on its own. It is a main clause. And then the last bit, because they were very thirsty. Again, because they're very thirsty, the question back is going to be, who was very thirsty? What are you talking about? So it's a subordinate clause. You actually, if you want to get deep into it, have a subordinating conjunction there. You have a word there that kind of indicates that you're about to deliver a subordinate clause. After, although, because, there's loads of different ones, but it kind of indicates, oh, this sentence is going to require another clause to make any sense to you. A couple more. Kind of obvious, maybe. What kind of clause is underlined in the sentence below? Well, it's either going to be a main clause, it could be a relative clause, it could be a subordinate clause. So have a little look. It says, if they could afford to. And the test you're going to run in your head is, could I just go up to somebody and say, if they could afford to? I couldn't say that because somebody would be expecting more detail from me. So that is a subordinate clause. Subordinate. Less important. Wouldn't stand on its own. But if we look at the other part of the sentence and the other clause, the ancient Romans ate well, that's a main clause. You could just tell someone that. One mark, well done me. And then the end one, question 50. So this would be the last question in an EGPS paper, just to keep you on your toes. Underline the subordinate clause in the sentence below. Don't get drawn into the fact that isn't always bracketed by a comma. So I've got a comma in the middle of this sentence here. It doesn't always work like that, and we'll see this example here. So Hassan and I are going to our dance class. We're going to be late as we miss the bus. So Hassan and I are going to our dance class, main clause. We're going to be late as we miss the bus. We've got to split this last bit. We're going to be late, would work as a main clause, but as we miss the bus is the subordinate part there, and as is the subordinating conjunction. So what I don't want to do is make it even more complicated by going through subordinating conjunctions, but they can be a good clue. It joins parts of sentences together, or it joins clauses together, but it indicates that one is less important or a subordinate clause is coming. So as we miss the bus, you couldn't just say as we miss the bus. I'm kind of looking at this sentence in three parts. Now, Hassan and I go to the dance class, part one, fine, main clause. We're going to be late, part two, main clause, as we miss the bus, part three, and that bit is the subordinate clause. But a tricky question. It is question 50 as well. So by that stage, you do get a couple of tricky ones thrown in. And just to indicate, by going back to the beginning of the flip chart here, even the beginning of the flip chart is a subordinate clause. So although they aren't easy to remember, that itself is a subordinate clause, and there is a subordinating conjunction, although. So I couldn't just talk to you on this video today and say, although they aren't easy to remember, because you're going to be expecting something else. You're going to be expecting a main clause. We use them all the time. So this bit here underlined is a subordinate clause, although they aren't easy to remember. And please do try to remember that they don't make sense on their own. If you just remember one thing from the video, that would be the thing. They don't make sense on their own. Would you sound odd if you just said that bit to somebody? And if that's the case, it's probably a subordinate clause. But I do think it's important that we don't just always rely on the kind of annoying sentences, but understand the words themselves, the terms, subordinate meaning less important, clause meaning subject doing a verb. If we can start to understand these words, these key terms in grammar, we can use them all the way through. We can use them when we're talking about a relative clause. We can use them when we're talking about a subordinating conjunction. It is really complicated for year 6. So hence why I'm doing these videos, because I know it can be really tricky. And like I said, I had to teach myself what a subordinate, or reteach myself what a subordinate clause was. Presumably I was taught it at some point in my life, but I didn't remember it in year 6. Hopefully you now will. It doesn't make sense on its own, and it requires a main clause as well. I hope the video has been helpful to you. If there are other grammar terms that you need, drop me an email, make a comment, however you need to, and I will do some more grammar videos, because I feel like we're on a bit of a push, we're on a bit of a roll with grammar right now. Have a great rest of your day. And some great revision if you're doing some, and ciao for now.